Chris and I continued to work afternoons in the casino from noon to 8 p.m. And even though we had a regular group of ladies gambling at our tables, we weren't allowed to interact with them at all. Apart from saying, "Place your bets, please," "No more bets," and announcing the winning number. A couple of sweet little old ladies liked to give me compliments, such as, "Oh, what lovely hair you have, dear." I might give them a smile, then I'd get, "Lovely smile too." The inspector sitting on the high chair at the top of the table watching all the action would frown at me, especially if it was Woody. I wasn't supposed to acknowledge the customers at all. Then I understood why. Bets were placed, each punter having different coloured chips. I spun the wheel and the ball dropped on 7 red. I announced the number and quickly checked the red and odd squares at the end of the table, and they weren't covered. So I just needed to calculate the amount of chips on the number and square around it. While I was clearing all other chips off the table, I glanced away from the end of the table where one of the ladies who was always being nice to me was sitting. Suddenly she spoke. "Don't forget to include my chips on the red and odd, dear." When I looked back, there were 3 green chips on the red and 3 on the odd square. I knew the chips hadn't been there when the ball landed, and I looked up at the inspector. Yes, it was Woody, who was supposed to be an extra pair of eyes on the table and punters at all times. More often than not, though, his eyes were focused on the revealing cleavages of the waitresses as they placed drinks on the tables, and he rarely took any notice of the ladies who lunch. I looked this nice lady in the eye, and she gave me the sweetest smile. So I began to doubt myself. Had the chips been there all the time, or did she slyly slip them onto the table when I briefly looked away? But she wouldn't do that, would she? Yes, she would. And this is what Woody warned us about. This was one of many examples where the crafty older ladies tried to cheat, except they weren't always the enemy. On this particular occasion, I calculated the winnings for 2 different coloured chips, yellow and green, and announced the amounts to Woody. Because I often reached the total before the inspector had time to do the calculations, I don't know how I did it, the inspector on duty would usually nod his head in agreement, even if he hadn't figured it out yet. He trusted me. "Not Woody," he said. "Count again, darling." I knew he hadn't got the totals yet, so I repeated the number. "Count again," he yelled. I was feeling very uncomfortable, and the ladies at the table, for all their faults, were looking at me sympathetically. What was I supposed to do? I knew the amounts of the winnings were correct, but I also knew that Woody needed to win. So I took a risk and reduced the winning totals by 2. Then Woody nodded his head. If the 2 ladies who had bets on the red 7 had been savvy enough, they would have known that they were being shortchanged. I was also worried that the eye-in-the-sky camera had picked it up and that I would be in trouble with the casino bosses. However, since Woody was one of the main guys there, and because I was working in favour of the casino by reducing the winnings by a couple of pounds, I never heard another word about it. From then on, though, I was ultra cautious as far as the ladies who lunch were concerned, and detached myself as much as possible. But I hated doing that. I was a people person, and it just wasn't in my nature. I felt like a machine, a robot. It was particularly hard seeing punters who were clearly addicted to gambling and who struggled with letting go of their money. I remember one man, probably in his 50s, whose clothes had seen better days. And he didn't look as if he had enough money for a coffee, let alone money to throw away on the roulette wheel. He'd placed quite a few bets at my table and wasn't getting any winning numbers. But like all compulsive gamblers, he had to keep going until he got a win. On this day, his luck was out. He put his head in his hands as if it was the end of the world. I wanted to say something to him to console him, but I wasn't allowed. When he left the table with such a grim look on his face, I worried he might harm himself. But a few days later, he was back. I was relieved to see him, but it was a bittersweet moment. On the other hand, there were gamblers for whom money meant nothing. A good-looking Greek man in his 30s who wore an expensive-looking suit with a cashmere overcoat slung casually over his shoulders would walk nonchalantly to one of the higher-paying tables, throw down a £50 note, lose that, and then go to another table and bet the same amount. He never sat down at a table and was probably only in the casino for half an hour. But in that time, he either lost a few £100 or won. It just didn't seem to faze him one way or the other. Within a month, Chris and I had graduated to working the evening shift from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., which was a lot more intense. We also noticed that the 20-minute on, 20-minute off rule seemed to fluctuate quite a bit, so that we were working longer than the required time and definitely being taken advantage of. For instance, a few of the roulette dealers didn't turn up for work during the Christmas and New Year period, so Chris and I had to cover for them. As you can imagine, Christmas Eve was very busy, and I worked for 2.5 hours straight without a break. It was grueling, not only because I had to keep switching from dealing on a right-handed table to a left-handed table, but I could hardly breathe from the cigarette smoke, and the gamblers were drunk and obnoxious. One lady, if I can call her that, said, "I can't stand this dealer. She's bad luck." She looked up at the inspector and said, "Can't you replace her?" I was actually ready to walk away. I was so exhausted and didn't need this woman's attitude. Thankfully, one of the decent inspectors got someone to take over from me so that I could have a break. By the time 4 a.m. rolled around, it was Christmas Day. But all Chris and I wanted to do was get back to our homes in Coventry and sleep for a week. One of the Chemin de Fer dealers, Ian, was originally from Coventry and was going there to spend Christmas with his parents. But he wasn't a very warm person and kept himself to himself, but he was nice enough to offer us a lift. Close to 4 hours later, just as everyone else was waking up and opening their Christmas presents, Chris and I were snuggled up in our respective beds with visions of spinning roulette wheels dancing in our heads. We'd had a few days off from Sergeant York Casino, so were fully prepared for New Year's Eve. Or so we thought. It was crazier than Christmas Eve, and once again Chris and I were forced to work for several hours without a break. When midnight came, we expected a big celebration, perhaps bells ringing, balloons falling from the ceiling, coloured streamers being thrown, champagne bottles popping. But no, it was business as usual. The gamblers hardly looked up from the table to acknowledge that a new year had arrived. Chris and I finally were able to take a break around 12:30, and we raised a glass of champagne in the staff room with a few other dealers to welcome in a new year in our lives. At this point, while most croupiers were biding their time at Sergeant York before they moved on to the Playboy Club in London or in Nassau in the Bahamas, where the big money was, we'd both decided that casino life was not for us. Even though our salary had increased from our training wage, no amount of extra money could convince us to stay at Sergeant York Casino. So we handed in our notice on the 2nd day of January and left a week later. Coincidentally, the casino was held up by masked gunmen the day after we left, and fingers were jokingly pointed at us, since it was pretty apparent that we weren't too happy with the way we'd been treated. However, it never occurred to Chris and I to get our revenge by robbing the casino. Now that would have been a great story. Next time, back to Greece and new adventures. Thanks for listening.